Welcome to the Global Startup Movement. I'm Andrew Berkowitz. My guest today is Donna Harris, world-renowned startup ecosystem builder and the co-founder of 1776. She previously served as the managing director for Startup America, working in partnership with the White House, Kauffman Foundation, and the Case Foundation, where she helped accelerate the formation of vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystems all across the US. She is a four-time entrepreneur, having started and successfully exited numerous companies, a member of the Global Entrepreneurship Network Board of Directors, a board member of the National Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and an entrepreneur in residence at Georgetown University. Donna, thank you so much for having me here.
Oh, I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, it's great to be back here. We were members of the Crystal City campus when I was building my last startup. It must be pretty surreal for you to come back here and to the DC campus and just kind of reflect on all the change that you've seen and help drive in the DC ecosystem.
Well, I always love entrepreneurs that describe their journey as my last startup or my prior startup or my startup before the current startup. So I completely understand that feel of being back.
And I mean, we all hear stories of successful entrepreneurs when they were kids, starting lemonade stands, or I would flip blow pops at lunch during middle school. But you took a little bit of a different approach and decided to sell worms to your neighbors.
I was a rebel when I was younger. I couldn't go with the standard lemonade stand.
But it was a pretty lucrative business for 10-year-old Donna, right?
I mean, it was a great exercise in market segmentation because we realized that we had the gardeners who would put the worms in their garden, and we had the fishermen who would use the worms as bait.
Right.
And so we segmented and sold all the worms.
That's great. But I want to start off back in actually 1997 with your first startup in Detroit. Could you tell us a little bit, what was it like trying to get a startup off the ground in a city in a time when all of the venture capital, all of the mentors, and really resources needed were all concentrated on the opposite side of the country in Silicon Valley?
If you think about that year, that was pre-dot-com craziness, boom and bust. And in Detroit's life cycle, it was in the middle of the big downward slide. GM was on the run, economy wasn't doing very well, and there wasn't a global movement of entrepreneurship. And so I was running a startup, but there was no one to talk to about it. There were no mentors. My peers around me were all working in big corporations. Most people thought I was a little crazy to leave my big company and go start something. And there was no capital. I didn't know about Silicon Valley because it didn't get as much press then as it did in the years following with the dot-com craziness. So you just heads down, tried to do the best you could without really knowing what you were doing and sort of figure it out as you go.
Yeah, and it must have been frustrating because I think that was a time period also when the local government was giving these massive tax credits to these large corporates, and it seems like they weren't even aware of this, the start of what became this startup movement.
Well, it was before Kauffman really put out the seminal study connecting entrepreneurship and jobs. And so I, as an entrepreneur, knew we could create jobs, and that if you could get lots of us, there would be a multiplier effect. But the standard sort of business of economic development was jobs by the thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands. And so that was really all about who can we recruit from another state to come to our state. And I felt that it was also doubling down on an industry that was dying in Michigan. There's a lot of focus on manufacturing and automotive. And meanwhile, entrepreneurs like myself were, building companies, creating jobs. I got zero tax incentive, zero tax relief. We even paid property taxes on our folding card tables that we sat at.
Wow.
So, when Kauffman finally did put out their research, for me, it was the great, see, I told you so. Right. Now we have data to point to that we can begin to really build a platform from.
Right, and that was in 2010 when that came out? Okay, and that's when you put out, I saw a report as well, that was very detailed. I'd be curious, so that first startup, it didn't, I guess, pan out the way you envisioned, but you proceeded after that to have numerous successful companies, numerous successful exits. What lessons did you learn from that initial failure that you were able to take away and use in the successful companies?
Well, when I think about each of my companies, there were learning experiences in each that built towards the next. So in my first company, it was all about picking a scalable market, right? The market that I chose was not a huge one. And it was a business model that I had that really wasn't a highly scalable model. And so understanding the economics of venture capital and what they're looking for and the misalignment with the kind of business that I had, and therefore I would be running a small business. I wouldn't be viable to be a venture capital business. That was an eye-opener for me. And there weren't classes to go to learn that in advance. So I learned that about a year in to my first company. And then you reach the realization of, okay, I'm running a nice little small business. Is this what I want to do with my life? And it really wasn't. I wanted to figure out, how can I take this thing out and really grow it? And so I joined another startup that was in a much bigger, much more scalable market, scalable business model, scalable product. And then that one was all about learning to go and pitch venture capitalists. How do you pitch? What are they looking for? How do you tell your story? What's important? What's not important? And then how do you manage the chaos that comes when you have an idea and then all of a sudden you get $20+ million? How do you grow quickly without being chaotic? And how do you build the culture and the team and the right processes to make sure that you succeed in execution once you get funded? So every experience was about learning from the past experience. But when I reflect on it in hindsight, I wish I would have known some of the things before I actually did them to learn them. And that's where the value of mentors and peers and a peer community really just became something I couldn't stop thinking about, that was so critical for entrepreneurs.
Right, and so going through that experience it seems like is what planted the seed for what eventually became your passion for traveling and ecosystem building, right?
So it seeded a couple things. One is really the recognition that there are smart people everywhere, and we're not getting the benefit of what they could build because they're not surrounded by support and an infrastructure and an ecosystem. The second is that if entrepreneurs really tackle important challenges, the way they think allows them to come up with completely unique solutions, and they potentially hold the key to solving some of our big world problems. And for me, it also was about technology, an understanding of the double side of the coin of technology. It's very, very empowering and can be the great equalizer, but it can also be the great unequalizer if everyone doesn't have access to it and we don't have access to the networks that are necessary to understand what you do with technology.
Right. And so it was during that time period when you came to DC?
I did. So sold the business in Michigan, took some time off, and then came to Washington, D.C. to work for a boutique government consulting firm. It was run by a couple of really just genius political experts who really didn't have the business expertise to grow their company. And so I didn't know a whole lot about politics at the time. I like to say, I sort of knew one party was the donkey and one was the elephant, but didn't quite know which or why. So it was just from there a 5-year experience in just growing that company and learning, a PhD in everything you didn't learn in civics class about how government actually works.
Right. And so how did you initially get in touch with Steve Case and get involved with what became Startup America?
So after I had my son in 2010, I took some time off. And, entrepreneurs were a lot like ADHD 8-year-old boys. We can't sit still very long. So when my son was napping, I was really thinking, it was the first time in my career I'd had a chance just to stop and think and reflect. And I was reflecting on all of these experiences I'd had and what I'd learned. And I kept coming back to this question of ecosystems and can we get entrepreneurs like myself to come together into a network to build communities of support for other entrepreneurs. And at the time I called it grassroots entrepreneurism. And I got everything that was in my head out into a PowerPoint presentation, mostly just to get it out of my head. And I started sharing it with some friends. And one of my friends, Amy Millman at Springboard, said, there's this thing that was just launched at the White House that you should look at. And so she connected me to someone over at Startup America. We had a conversation about what they were trying to do and my views about how having a strong ecosystem was like the meat and potatoes of what Startup America should be doing. Because without that, it's very, very hard for anything else to succeed. And so I was invited to join and sort of take that and run with it.
Yeah. And so you had the opportunity through that vehicle to travel across the U.S. and really take a leading role in connecting all these different startup ecosystems. How did that experience in your travels inspire the vision for what eventually became 1776?
Yeah, so in the 2 years in that role, I visited almost every single state in the union, and I met amazing people. And ultimately, 750 or so people like me joined the movement and came together as an informal network. And our thesis was really quite simple. None of us has all the answers, but we can launch 1,000 experiments and see what works. And if something seems to work in one city, let's share that and replicate it to other cities. And so it was very much a philosophy of give rather than get, but built on relationships and creating this informal network of people. From that experience, obviously living in Washington, D.C. and knowing that Startup America was a short-term project, I spent time looking at our own market and saying, how do we build a strong community here in DC? What do we have that's unique in Washington, DC? And while everyone is bemoaning the fact that it's a government town and how awful that is, what would happen if we leaned into that and embraced that? Could we become a city that embraced entrepreneurs that were tackling government-regulated industries, which, by the way, are most industries where we have pressing problems that need to be solved, and important problems like education and healthcare and energy and clean water and agriculture. And so for me, it was a really fascinating opportunity to put to work what I had been working with entrepreneurs around the country to do in our own market with some really unique assets to play with.
Right.
So that was the genesis for 1776.
And was the vision always this global incubation platform and seed fund, or is that something that developed over time as you started to build this out?
Yeah, such a great question. So most people look at 1776 and assume we launched as a co-working space and then we added all these other things along.
Right.
And that's actually the opposite of how it evolved. So my co-founder and I, when we were looking at what we wanted to do, it was very much go around the world and find these startups that want to change the world, fund them, and then help them scale by sort of merging lean startup and regulatory hacking, right? How do you actually do lean startup in the context of government and institutions and bureaucracy? And when we got out and started talking to people about it and doing discovery, people looked at us like we had four heads. Because in Washington, D.C., when you say startup, the next two words out of people's mouths are Silicon Valley. And so we needed people to be able to come and interact and see these entrepreneurs and understand that, no, they're everywhere. And by the way, they're doing things more than Snapchat and dating apps. And you lawmaker, you lobbyist, you think tank expert play a key role in helping these companies succeed. And if they succeed, they could actually change the world, right? That became very inspiring for people. And so we immediately said, okay, wait a minute, we need a space. Let's figure that out. Initially, we were going to partner with someone else who had space. And then that fell apart. And so we decided, let's just plunge in and do it ourselves. And so, when we made the announcement that we were launching 1776, people looked at it and saw the space and said, oh, they're a co-working space, where we had much bigger ideas about how the space was part of the thesis, which was really about mobilizing the global startup world.
Yeah, and really, I think the two vehicles that you did that through, one, I think Union was a big part of using software to scale and connect all these all these ecosystems to a platform that exposed them to the mentors that really, and I've found in my travels around the world, particularly in, not so much anymore in Europe, but in Africa, in South America, Southeast Asia, there's just a lack of this infrastructure of mentors that we're so fortunate to have here in the U.S. And so it seems like Union was a big part of your vision is to solve that, and then also the 1776 Global Challenge Cup was a big part of that as well.
If you look at how 1776 unfolded, shortly after we launched, we announced the Challenge Cup. We went on tour, and I think the first year we visited 45 cities. We thought that thousands of startups. And when we finished that first year, we thought to ourselves, how do we track all of this? And how do we actually help these companies? Certainly a giant Excel spreadsheet is not the answer to this. And so, we began thinking about, for our own purposes, how do we use technology to know who these companies are, know who's succeeding, know who needs what, who needs to be connected to which mentor. Technology could play a really important role in that. And as I thought back about my experiences in Detroit, the thing that kept ringing true and still rings true for me is if you're an entrepreneur who happens to have grown up in a particular city, how do we make sure that you are able to stay in that city, yet get access to whatever resource you need to grow your company, even if it doesn't exist in the same city that you live in? And technology can do that. Mentors, customers, corporations, doing discovery, partners, you should be able to use technology for that. And so from an ecosystem building perspective, looking beyond just the silo of your own ecosystem, but much more thinking it is a global ecosystem of which each of the cities are nodes. How do we operate like one rather than individual cities in their own swim lanes?
Right. And I mean, what did you see during your travels in comparison to when you were traveling across the U.S.? Because one thing that I've noticed, we're fortunate here in the U.S. in that we have this one large homogeneous market that we can attack. But one of the challenges of building a company in Europe, in Africa, and Southeast Asia is this market fragmentation that exists. In that, if I build and successfully scale my company in let's say in Kenya, that doesn't necessarily mean that I could take that playbook and go and execute it in Nigeria or in Rwanda.
But we often forget in our sort of U.S.-centric view of things how large some of those markets are, right? So if you take an investment like we have in a company called Twiga Foods, right? They're based in Kenya, that's their first market. They can grow a pretty healthy-sized company on Kenya alone. Like Africa is a massive, massive, massive continent made of very, very, very large and highly populous countries. The challenge is that we here in the U.S. are very venture capital-centric, and our ecosystem building efforts have unfortunately been very focused on that. But when you go to other markets, they don't have as much access to capital as we do. So a lot of the scaling is really tamped down because they don't have access to the resources that they need to go after the markets, more so than market size.
Right.
But the other opportunity they do have is that they can test their product in their home market with pretty low risk of publicity. If the product doesn't work and then they come to the US for the prime time market, nobody really knows that they sort of spent 2 years testing it in another market. So you do have a leg up on some of the entrepreneurs that way. In the US, you're here, it's the prime time. If you fail, it's a pretty visible failure.
Right.
Here in the US.
Yeah, and I think the lack of capital, while it's definitely a challenge, it also on the other hand means that only companies that are solving real practical problems are getting funded.
And with real revenue.
Exactly, and Twig is an incredible company. They started with bananas, and they're solving the supply chain problem in Africa, and the logistical infrastructure there makes it hard, makes it really hard.
That's right, but so many investors in the United States looked at Twiga and thought, it's bananas in an African country. Right. Thank you for coming. And there's a much, much bigger story here if you really understand the marketplace dynamics that a place like Kenya and many sub-Saharan African countries have. And they're exactly in the right place at the right time with bringing technology to the supply chain there.
Yeah. And I was in Nairobi actually back in October, and I met with some really, really incredible companies. But the common theme was that there just aren't a lot of high net worth individuals who are making angel investments. You can count them on maybe one or two hands. And when I was there, it was that was really confusing to me, because I would look around in Nairobi and there's all these sky rises, there's all these large companies, and it didn't make sense. Like, where are all these people that own, this? And what I realized, it was a Medium article that came out by this guy by the name of Teo from this company in Nigeria called Paga. And what he talked about is how in Africa, in a lot of developing markets, the high net worth individuals, they don't have a lot of cash. They're just highly leveraged against assets.
Asset-rich cash.
Exactly. And so there's not a lot of liquidity in these markets.
But, I think in some ways we share some challenges here in the U.S. with that dynamic. If you look at the study that Richard Florida just put out, that 85% of capital goes to the 5 largest metropolitan areas in the U.S. I think that's a pretty stunning number. And when you go into the cities that aren't in that list, it's not that they don't have enough wealth. Every state in the United States has enough wealth to justify and support a huge ecosystem of startups. The problem is the wealth is not investing, it's not active, it's not activated. And if it's activated in startups, odds are it's investing in a Silicon Valley fund. It's not investing in its home market. Right? So the problem isn't enough wealth. The problem was the activation of the wealth.
Right. And so I mean, we've kind of started to see this narrative of people leaving Silicon Valley for lower cost markets. I mean, do you see that playing out, and like, do you think that the, I guess, quote unquote solution is to have all this concentration in Silicon Valley, distributed across the country, or do you think it's more so, activating the local angels that are already there in those markets?
I mean, there's some very real reasons why Silicon Valley investors don't invest outside the Valley. Proximity is one key issue. If you can deploy $1 in your backyard, or you can deploy $1 1,000 miles away, probably you're going to deploy it in the backyard because you can keep an eye on it or go grab coffee. But beyond that, there's also the challenge that because it's a bit of a catch-22. Okay? Because there's not a vibrant ecosystem, there's not depth of talent, there's not follow-on capital, there's often not technical skills. And so even if there's a will to invest in these markets, the risk is higher in those markets, right? Even though the cost might be lower. And so this sort of economic trade-off decision is happening all the time. And cities have to look at their home markets and activate the capital, but it has to be one prong of a multi-pronged strategy. You have to activate capital. You have to figure out how you're going to raise follow-on capital for the companies. You've got to build the technical talent. You've got to build the executive talent. It is a long-term effort that isn't about, let's go create an incubator and have some startup events. This is some heavy lifting that has to be done. So we've made a lot of progress the last 10 years with recognizing the importance of entrepreneurship, raising the conversation about the need for ecosystems, but we've still got a lot of heavy lifting to do.
So can I ask you a couple questions about yourself? Maybe some habits that have contributed to your success over past 10, 15 years.
Sure. Habits. Well, I mean, first and foremost, I'm a big believer in taking time to stop and process. Every bit of your journey isn't about forward progression. Sometimes your journey is about learning. And if you recognize that you're in an environment where life is trying to teach you rather than advance you, you can reduce your frustration level considerably. And I'm a person of faith and Christian, so taking time to read and pray and just remind myself of what's important in life is really important to me. I've been on missions trips and I've seen kids living in abject poverty that it really puts things in perspective, that maybe it isn't the end of the world, that my business didn't get the funding that I wanted it to get, or that customers said no. I think we get caught up in the tornado of entrepreneurship frenzy that we forget perspective sometimes, and we're walking around very, very stressed and a lot of pressure on ourselves, that we could let some of that pressure go with perspective.
Yeah, and I know my travels at least have really opened my eyes up to the world and given me that perspective. And I think one thing that's really been an important practice for me every morning is just gratitude. Just, taking the time to sit down, write things that I'm grateful for, and then that at least puts me in the right mind that I need to go about execute on the day.
You really hit on something that I wish everybody would embrace and try, which is travel. Right? That if we live in our own little bubble and exist in our own little world, and we don't get out and go to places that are unlike the place we live, we don't get that perspective. And oftentimes those are the places where the inspiration is going to come. Right? So get out and travel and try new things and go to new places and meet new people to get that perspective. It's so critical.
And so what's next for Donna?
What's next? Question. So after stepping away from a day-to-day operational role about a year ago, I've been doing a lot of research. Right? For me, the successes of 1776 and Union and seeing that moving forward led me to some deeper questions about economic inequality, the digital revolution. How do we make sure that cities and individuals are all flourishing? And what do we need to do as a nation, and frankly, even beyond the U.S., what do we need to do globally around this very, very important time in society? And so I've got some theories on that I have been pilot testing the last year, and I'll be releasing some of that soon and moving forward publicly on some initiatives around the results of that.
Awesome. Well, I'm excited to see what you have in store. If you enjoyed this interview, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and subscribe to our podcast to see and follow my journey traveling the world, exploring the world's startup ecosystems, and interviewing the ecosystem builders of the world. Donna, thank you so much for having the time.
Yeah, I'm glad to be here.